Mel Gibson appeared on The View with the expectation of battle. The hosts believed they would degrade him on live television, but a few minutes later the one peaceful sentence and a shift in tone ultimately flipped the studio upside down. The crowd applauded, and the hosts were unable to speak before we began to tell us from where you're observing and strike to ensure you don't miss any moments, subscribe. They believed they had him surrounded. The View's co-hosts were prepared for the scheduled combat for that morning was an open discussion with Mel Gibson, but everyone knew what was going on behind the scenes. It was a true takedown, and Gibson walked onto the stage, nodding and smiling calmly to the audience and sat down on the other side of from Joy Behar, Whoopi Goldberg, and tension existed despite Sunny's hosting. Electrifying sensation that is almost choreographed, and as soon as Whoopi leaned in and questioned her the first time, and it was obvious instead of being an interview, this was an ambush. So Mel, Whoopi's voice started with a hint of restrained irony, you've been speaking out in favor of you lately for foreign films, you must pay a 100% tariff. Truly consider economics and censorship, now, nationalism is the solution. The audience giggled uncomfortably as the camera, without blinking, he zoomed in on Mel. Leaning forward, he spoke gently. Helping American workers isn't the same as its survival through censorship. There was a joy burst in loudly after a lengthy silence. You claim to be defending jobs, but isn't this just one more tactic to why now, why you, and what is Trump's agenda? Gibson looked at her calculatingly, because I've observed the results of Hollywood sales. I've been employed in this place for many years. And the instant you cease making investments in your own individuals, actors, and crews, you become enslaved to your communities. Markets that are indifferent to your culture. Some people clapped and others moved. Sunny narrowed her and the rest remained mute. Mel, you discuss culture. But let's face it, you have a past, an unattractive one who makes sexist and racist remarks. Should we actually take you? Honestly, just because you're waving now, the jab was sharp, and it was an American flag. Smacked hard, and the studio went silent. Stopped, he didn't wince, he didn't understand defensive, I made some serious errors, and I purchased them, but given that it means something to me to sit here today. Decided to confront it, and I will continue to do so. If I can assist in repairing what's damaged. There was silence instead of cheering, and then a single clap slowly followed by another. The momentum began to change. Whoopi attempted to take back authority, but tariffs, Mel, don't fix the character you're speaking about. Regarding economic barriers, but what about demolishing the barriers you erected? That's Mel leaned into his voice as it happened. You don't knock down walls by yelling at others, you undermine them by paying attention to those with whom you disagree. The whole room was frozen, and no one anticipated that he wouldn't do that, and it's like that the story began to fall apart. A storm was arranged by the co-hosts, however I forgot that Mel Gibson doesn't flee by the second portion. Lightning was evident that the co-hosts were adjusting. It's possible that the teleprompters still read mild political teasing, yet the atmosphere is Behar's set was anything but joyful. Sunshine muttered as she shuffled her note cards. Whoopi's ear cams captured something. Mel Gibson sat softly, almost rolling. His fingers were still lightly touching the calm armrests, made them feel more uneasy. More than rage could ever. So let's talk economy, Joy stated in a harsher tone. You now believe that imposing a 100% tax on foreign films will benefit Americans. Isn't that simply going to begin a trade war and increase the cost of cinema tickets? Pricey. Gibson gave a hesitant nod as though she simply posed the most sensible query. I understand how tariffs sound in the world. Aggressive. But more aggressive than that is how we have allowed studios to ship post-production production from cheaper sources abroad. American crews and labor pools simply in order to save money. He looked at the live viewership. We're not in a competition, we're undercutting, and if we don't make a line someplace in Hollywood becomes a ghost town, a cheer and a few applause instead of cutting to the crowd, the camera in the back room. Producers were already leaning in, hot, sunny, but that's not how capitalism functions. If you are unable to compete on a global scale, but you might not supplying Mel's jaw with adequate value little tightened, you know what else? Fairness must be a priority for capitalism. On the ground, it's a dash to the bottom for competition. And the first people to fall are the workers. Whoopi added, obviously attempting to maintain control that resembles the speech of a union. I don't mind that Gibson shot at all. Returned more quickly this time since the woman on set is clutching a boom microphone. Editing video until 3 in the morning, they're trying, but they're not driving Lamborghinis. Burbank rent payment pause once more after a few applause. The curveball Joy placed a printed piece of paper inside. This is in your most recent interview. You stated, and I quote, America needs to quit acting like globalism is the solution to all problems. That's your position? He didn't even glance. Yes, isn't it the quote he just looked up? It's simply isolationism. No, he said firmly. Putting what's real first, we've allowed globalism has turned into a front for exploitation of employees of the trust culture. I'm saying that we block out the world. We quit promoting ourselves. The remarks were brief but weighed heavily on the air. You're turning, but Sonny interrupted the stillness. This in a mass campaign of some sort. Mel leaned forward, composed yet unflinching. No, I'm reminding them that they're worthy. Better, and then suddenly the dynamic changed, but not quite yet. But enough that Joy's subsequent remarks appeared a little softer, but will be immediately behind you when the camera pans out and you could watch the show's commercial. The co-host's eyes showed that this wasn't proceeding as they had intended, and they were finding no means to prevent. The break was brief, yet the change in mood lasted a long time. The producers continued to whisper furiously into the audience's earpieces. The coordinators gestured for additional applause. Cues, but it was irrelevant because something had moved, and not only on the screen. Mel Gibson wasn't merely upholding the law. He was now defending his presence, and the co-hosts saw that it was faltering as Sonny did not waste any time as the show returned. Let's not act as though the past doesn't issue, she stated. There are numerous those who believe you shouldn't have. Mel, you have stated things on a platform. Are we just doing hurtful, offensive things? Expected to forget that since you arrived in here and raised some good points. The Mel inhaled gently as the air thickened. Gazed directly ahead. I don't want nobody can forget his voice, even for I was furious, careless, and hurt for a long time. Individuals, and I have no justification for it. I'm sorry, but I can't make demands. Pardoning some of the audience members, I came here expecting you'd nod softly. Bring it up, he went on. And you ought to, since development doesn't originate from dragging, is the source of avoiding the past. It out, asking, and looking it in the face. If you remain the same individual, the studio wasn't uncomfortable, but was silent once more. However, joy and curiosity attempted to recover the momentum. But how can we be certain that this isn't merely a rebranding attempt at a return? Mel smiled slightly. You can't. However, I wouldn't if I were trying to get applause. Be currently seated and discussing, I would be peddling culture wars and tariffs. Even Whoopi let the line fall in the sequel. Gave a grudging laugh, but Sonny wasn't. Have you mentioned that you've changed, but this nationalism by tough guys sounds like the Mel Gibson is still the same, but with a distinct coat. And then that was when Mel calmly leaning in, but locked in. I don't believe it's difficult to wish for your nation to. I believe it can stand on its own 2 feet. Accountable, and I don't believe it's nationalism in order to cherish the location that brought you up and desired to treat it people better. he said after pausing. Everyone is silently terrified of becoming named a name we couldn't remember how to stand for something, nobody else will replied, followed by a startling noise. Louder, longer applause this time, and the audience wasn't responding to they were responding to. Excellence. Another genuineness, whether they were listening, whether they agreed or not, and whoopee, it made all the difference. Nearly glanced down at her notepad. With reluctance, we will discuss, she responded, Hollywood next, but first, Mel cut in gently, I'm referring to Hollywood, she arched her brow. Went on, when your industry begins treating individuals as if they were just statistics when the only important factor is overseas income, and when sincere communication gets harmful, but it's not entertainment, which is in charge, and we should worry everyone about that, Joy said. Didn't follow up or interrupt Sonny. Not even the producers showed a clip. Signal, as nobody anticipated him to be the one about authority, and definitely not in the same way as the camera retreated for a subsequent commercial. The Mel Gibson's expressions on set spoke it all. Wasn't merely responding to inquiries, he was returning the microphone. By the time the third section rolled around, the producers have ceased to act as though this was proceeding as planned on social media. Was already buzzing about the live performance. Half the time, the tweet stream had burst. Hashtags applauding Mel Gibson's. The opposite side accuses the perspective of shedding authority over its own platform, and nevertheless, none of that stress persisted. The camera whoopee came back with a compelled changing gears with a smile. Let's talk, with laced fingers, she said, Hollywood, firmly before her, you've been outspoken about the sector changing its return to America, but have you not? Hollywood was more beneficial to most? Mel relaxed by leaning back a little. That's precisely what he stated, and I have it now. I am speaking up because I have witnessed what takes place behind the scenes. Priorities change, how narrative is told. Becomes propaganda in the manner that skill being ignored in favor of politics. Sonny, okay, so you believe that Hollywood's? Mel said, I think it scared, but it was broken. Joy tilted her head in fear of what would happen. Didn't think twice about being afraid of irrelevant, afraid of being honest, afraid of the very individuals it says it represents. The audience whispered to one another in the Gibson bent as the front row gave a gentle clap. Looking ahead, we used to produce movies that questioned authority, that made difficult requests. Queries, but now you can test everything, then you have a poisoned, hazardous label. Out of date, he looked at the panel. All of those things have been me, but what I won't be a repeat of the silent whoopee. However, some of this is just accountability. The world has evolved, people now expect more, and I'm not opposed to that. Gibson's response to accountability was, we act in opposition to selective accountability. Such as redemption is not possible, but just for specific individuals. Do you think that second chances are possible? Forgiveness cannot be sold and cancelled simultaneously. When that one stung, Joy even winced. And Sonny began to sense something. Didn't the opportunity go in for the hit? That you're saying this now is convenient. Mel, after you've lost everything, didn't you notice that I've lost several prospects for friendships based on my reputation? However, I still have my voice. And then he purposefully paused, which is what causes anxiety in others. The crowd surged more loudly than previously. Whistles of applause, even a few cheers, and the co-hosts looked for the first time. Sincere, astonished, not because Mel had said a ridiculous thing, but because he not been cool, collected, truthful, and the worst thing for them was that he was being heard. Whoopee through a tight commercial grin, we'll be back shortly, but everyone in attendance was aware that the moment had already there when the show returned. The studio wasn't the only place that felt differently. It was the viewers who had arrived anticipating a show were leaning forward with arms crossed and brows crossed, furrowed in interest rather than rage. You sense that something uncommon was happening. Joy Behar is obviously confused. Attempted to change the topic of conversation. Alright, let's put politics aside. She briefly stated, let's chat about your career. You've had tremendous highs and extremely public lows, so why don't you return now, Mel? Examined the space before settling his "we don't have time, so we're keeping an eye on her." He told them not to wait any longer because this nation's industry is nearing a breaking point. And if those who have witnessed the inside, keep quiet about who the audience mumbled again, will a beat? It's sunny when you remark that Hollywood's collapse, which is a bit dramatic, turned without collapsing in her direction. Changing becomes something it was never intended to serve as a location for stories, it's now a platform for catchphrases, and when all things turn into a message, no one no longer hears the truth. Whoopi looks up. What's your truth, Mel? He asked forcefully. Didn't skip a beat that all musicians do. Every American worker ought to be able to express disagreement without being banished because of that. Freedom of expression never ends. When someone receives that patriotism isn't hate makes me uneasy. Because national pride isn't extremist cheers, not courteous cheers, genuine spontaneity. Even Joy seemed startled. Mel went on, they say Hollywood needs more diversity, okay? Begin with the variety of perspectives. I've dealt with individuals from a variety of backgrounds. Every conviction, but you know what shuts fastest down a viewpoint that doesn't? The audience's reaction to the story was nodding. The phones were now uncrossed. Sunny crossed her arms while filming. And what about the story you told? What about the harm caused by your previous comments and actions? Gibson nodded and said, I live with it, Day, and I ought to, but development isn't it? Is demonstrated by revealing, not by concealing. Getting up and talking while knowing people continue to question you. He looked out for the crowd. If I come here to win their approval, I would have said a safe thing, but I came here because it matters, didn't I? Because of what we say in spaces such as these, rumbles outside of them, then quiet. A few individuals stood in pleasure and applauded more. Lifted her hands in a half-joking manner, all right. We understand that Mel Gibson is popular. Obtained a few giggles, but the tension had broke. The audience had not turned opposing the viewpoint necessarily, but in the direction of something different, something genuine, and the next portion, as the hosts were aware, was the producers were quickly on their way. Trying desperately to alter the tone, but the momentum that was Mel's. Now the producers wished to avoid a recurrence of the final section, but it was already out of their hands. They had attempted to change the subject. Lowering the volume down to the point of breaking at first, nothing worked, and Mel Gibson was regulating the tempo, and even worse, he wasn't being irascible or theatrical. The second time, he was doing it calmly. Whoopi began the segment by attempting to Mel, calm down. We've spoken. The political sector in the past, she stated with a tight smile, let's discuss potential remedies. What do you think about America and Hollywood? Mel didn't even blink at what she needed right now. Even when it's ugly, he spoke the truth. Particularly when it's the studio fell, horrible. Silent at the moment, we're more terrified of more likely to upset people than to lie to. They are the issue that we don't need. Safer areas, we need more courageous discussions. That a few individuals cheered more. Joy then leaned forward in an attempt to return to familiar territory. Although discussions without responsibility simply turn into noise, shouldn't there be repercussions for offensive speech? People utterly agreed with Mel, yet there's a distinction between causing harm to someone and we've lost that when we disagree with them. We have distinguished discomfort as a crime, he said after pausing, and we've convinced ourselves that just one side has the authority to define offensive. The sentence was there, and it was silent. Initially like a door shutting in some place off stage, but the impact was immediate. Whoopi sat back, happy, and blinked. Her mouth opened as if she were going to speak something, but the crowd didn't still. They appeared to be holding their breath. They weren't yelled at or furious. However, they hit because they didn't simply contest the panel, they contested the room, and nobody had a minute to come back. Mel. I'm not comfortable with silence. He declared, I'm here to win. Anyone over should speak the truth, and if we are unable to that fearlessly, so we've already lost, at which point a voice spoke. The audience yelled, let him speak. There was a round of applause, then cheering. The hosts attempted to dismiss it with a smile, but it was obvious that something had come free. The one they had written in their script. Now that the heads were gone, they were the ones. Mel was leading another reaction while there was a commercial break, but this time no, since none wanted to miss it, one moved. After returning from the commercial, what happened next? Although the studio appeared the same, it wasn't. Moreover, the camera moved across the hosts. However, something had changed with their grins were tighter and their stance more rigid. The momentum shifted, and Mel Gibson, he was quiet and steady, yet there was a benefit to him now that he was aware of, was when everything had been as happiness grew. Behar leaped in. Pushing more forcefully at first, then, you say you're, her voice said, I'm here to speak the truth. A little higher, but let's be truthful, when your words cause division among those you're not. Mel, you are a symbol for the unifiers. Far right for fury over controversy. Mel slowly nodded. I can't regulate the perceptions that others have of me. Stated, but I have control over my words, and when I witness a nation tearing itself apart, aside from slogans and catchphrases, I'm going to speak, regardless of who it is. Sunny was upset, and her tone quickly followed. Astute, and what about when you say the harm? I accept responsibility. Mel answered, but accountability entails embracing it and addressing it while standing here. He glanced directly at her before vanishing. Where are the other people who hit it? Was no longer only about him, it was regarding all those who had been silenced, driven out and blacklisted, not due of crimes, but because. To Whoopi's thoughts softly exhaled. You know, Mel, she murmured. It's calmer now, and many people are home. Believe that you're only doing something for a. Mel didn't grin when she returned, so I don't need a return, he stated. I need a nation that has not lost the ability to forgive. The room fell silent, and the camera's angle changed. Firmly on Sunny's face, she gave you a blink. Could see that line in her eyes. Not because it was ostentatious, but Mel glanced out because it cut deeply. Back to the audience, you don't. I must be liked, he said, but if you consider canceling every person who has flaws improves the world, you're not supporting your concealment. A slow clap began with just one individual, then after 2 and 10, the room was completely occupied. With cheers that are louder than anything else. Yet the co-hosts exchanged a quick look. The appearance that they had abandoned control. The audience has selected the location for Lean, and it wasn't pointing at the table. He sat back without smirking or gloating. He simply allowed the sound to pass by. Since he was aware of their attempt to make him a villain, he turned into anything.